persistence is
Yes.
key. You'd be surprised how many offices I've sat in and told, listen, the only reason that you're here right now is because if we didn't set a meeting up, you were never going to leave me alone. You were never going to stop. So you're here. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Let's go.
You're listening to Creatives Prevail, unraveling the stories of creative professionals.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Creatives Prevail. I'm your host, Mike Zimmerlich, and my next guest is Jason Hollis, artist, developer, producer, and owner of the Nashville venue, The Eighth Room. In this interview, we discuss the importance of networking and putting yourself at the right place at the right time. We also dive into why, with no prior knowledge of running a venue, he decided to save a historic Nashville location to open The Eighth Room. Let's get into it. Hey, Hollis, how are you?
I'm good, buddy. How are you?
I'm doing good, thanks. We were talking just before about all kinds of different things. In fact, I'm really excited about this interview because I think there's going to be a lot of ground we're going to be able to cover. But I did actually want to start off on mentioning on how amazing the Eighth Room is. And we'll definitely get into that as far as how that all came about. But it looks quite amazing, quite impressive. So first of all, I want to start off by saying congratulations on that fact, because that's an incredible feat. So
thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
I can only imagine. But It was interesting because your background wasn't in running venues. It was more into artist development and music production. And you started at quite an early age, at age 17. I mean, for myself, I started more in my early 20s, and I feel like I'm a late bloomer in comparison to so many people. So did you know even before then that you really wanted to get into music? How did that come about?
Yeah, it's funny because I think that there's things that inspire us at a very early age, and for me, it was number one, my dad's record collection. He had a great record collection, and it was a lot of bands from London's. Like it was the Stones and the Beatles and the Kinks and Herman's Hermits and all these great bands I started listening to. But I think the real thing, it's funny, but this was like a big kind of turning point for me was, I'm a Gen Xer. So Saturday morning cartoons, late 70s, early 80s, that's what you did. You woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning, you started watching Saturday morning cartoons, and by 10 you were out riding your bicycle, But during that time of these great Saturday cartoons, like every cartoon had a band. Every cartoon, whether it was Scooby-Doo or Jabberjaws or Captain Caveman, Fraggle Rock. It was like everything was around music, and it was really the Muppets that did something for me. It was a trigger. The Muppets kind of still trigger me, like in a really good way. You had Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem. Dr. Teeth was probably like the coolest thing that you saw on TV with his gold tooth and his hat. It was very like Dr. John, Animal. You had these great characters. And then with the Muppets, they always had these brilliant artists. Elton John, Liza Minnelli, like all these great artists would come in and sing with them. And there was something about that it resonated magic to me. And I think at like around 7, 8 years old, I just became obsessed, and that kind of carried through into elementary, and everything was about like what I was listening to and the way that you dressed according to the music that you were listening to. And in my middle school years, my parents separated when I was very young, and my mom started dating this guy named Fred Ziegler, and Fred, my pops now, he owned Ziegler Music, which was a musical instrument store in Baton Rouge. They had multiple stores, and I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. You know, my mom's dating a guy that owns the music store. This is where all the bands hung out. You know, so when I was 15, I started there, kind of cleaning horns, restringing guitars, doing like some grunt work stuff. And on the weekends, they allowed me to go on the floor and do some sales. And I ended up working at the music store from middle school through high school. And I just, you know, there was just a profound thing that there was nothing else I was going to do. I was going to be in music, and I knew when I was in early on in high school that, you know, the musical sales side of it, although I was really good at it, you know, I was a record guy. I wanted to make records. You know, the guys that I was reading about, Andrew Luke Oldham, Ahmet Artigan, you know, these were record men, and that's kind of what I wanted to get into and go do. And you know, my parents knew nothing about that, so they were like, well, you have to go figure it out, you know, and it's kind of what I did. But, you know, long story short, it's one of these things, you know. It's funny because I went back to Baton Rouge not too long ago, and I was with a friend of mine, and he was like, you know, I've always been really, really kind of jealous of you. And I was like, why? You know? And he was like, well, you've always known, ever since I've known you, you've always known what you've wanted to do. He's like, I still have no idea what I want to do. You know, and I was like, oh, you know, never thought of that. But I think it's just one of those things where something happened to me, and it was music. And along with that comes a lot of work, a lot of cruel work, and a lot of hard times. You know, the failure completely outweighs the successes in this, and you have to be built extremely tough. You know, but I think it's one of those things I've just always known. You know.
Wow. Do the music stores still exist today in Baton Rouge?
They had a 50-year run, and right before COVID, and my pops was he was looking to retire, and Guitar Center came in and made him an offer that he couldn't refuse, and they ended up selling to Guitar Center, which was it was a great time to get out during that time. I think he still wishes he had the stores now, because it's kind of like his legacy. It's what he did for forever. But yeah, it's no longer.
I do appreciate the fact that you recognize the work that you did in those music stores, and that the understanding the instruments. I mean, because you were literally hands-on on these instruments, on a regular basis. Yeah. And I can imagine that gave you a true appreciation to not only to music in general, but also the musicians that play those instruments. And when I was a very, very young, I was a pianist as well as a trumpet player when I was older, and played the trumpet through high school as well as through college. And there's something to be said about mastering that instrument, and it's a very, very difficult thing to do, is to become to the point where you control the instrument rather than the instrument controlling you. And again, to maintain those instruments as well, it's, it requires a lot of care. I'll put it that way. It requires a lot of care towards those instruments.
It's funny, like in middle school, late middle school, early high school, when new toys would come in. I remember when like the Roland 808 drum machine came out, and we got one in the store, and I just remember like spending the night at the music store. It would be a Saturday night. I'd be like, I want to spend the night here, and you guys just pick me up tomorrow, lock me in the store. I was like, I've got everything I need, and just staying up all night and just learning to program and learning what these new devices were. And it's, I can dabble in all of them. I'm good at none of them. I realized very early on that my whole life I've been surrounded around phenomenal musicians, especially coming out of like the Baton Rouge, New Orleans area, and being in the music store. When I was in the music store, we dealt with all the local bands. I knew all the local bands. In high school, I started our A&R department out of the music store. So I was, you know, giving, able to cut musicians, really good deals and get them set up with A&R accounts and all that. So I mean, early on, from meeting everybody from like Dr. John and Alan Toussaint and Chuck Berry and Ray Charles, just being around all these people was a real blessing. You know, it was just an absolute blessing, and it's also you kind of get to see behind the scenes and how it all works, and it was just like for me, it was like I was just a sponge. I just absorbed everything I possibly could around these people. So yeah,
Smart.
fascinating.
It's very, very smart. I mean, to have that opportunity, right, and to, like you said, to absorb everything that's going around you is truly incredible. I'm curious though, then were you able to transition? Because going from the, working at a music store, right, to doing arts development to then music production, that's still quite a bit of a leap. So what did you do first? Like, how did you figure out what you need to do that first step into developing that part of your career?
Well, I think it's this is pre-internet days, and when you wanted to learn about these things, you buy a book and you learn about what Ahmet Ertegun did and his steps and how he kind of transitioned into being a great record man. So for me, it was one thing. I knew that I had to kind of get out of my backyard, and you had to either be in LA or New York. And for me, it was, I went to my parents and I was like, I want to make records. And they were like, well, we know nothing about that. So you're just going to have to go figure it out. So the day I graduated high school, I moved to Los Angeles. And I had no family, no friends, nothing. I'd been planning this for about a year. So I knew where I was going to live. I had I went and bought a LA map. I bought an LA Times. I found my apartment. I had it pinned on the map. I had my route. It was kind of like a manifestation thing where it was like I almost had like a visualization board, and it was my entire room because there was pictures of like young Rick Rubin and Andrew Loog Oldham and then the map and Los Angeles, and then my route to get to Los Angeles, and then where I was going to live, and so I dove in head first, and for me at that time the game plan was to get out of where I was and to get into a new city, right, and kind of start my journey. Past that, I didn't have much of a game plan, and that's where I think it slowed me down during those first 2 years, was not knowing really what I was walking into. It was just blind faith, So my first 2 years in Los Angeles were really spent surrounding myself around record guys. LA is so big, especially coming from somebody from a small town. You get to LA and you don't realize that the record company's in Santa Monica, and then it's in Hollywood, and then it's in Burbank and Glendale, and these are all like, they take you a day to get to and from. It's not like you can just kind of like walk down the street like here in Nashville. You have 16th and 17th Avenue, and everything's on those two streets, and you can kind of walk to different ones. It was very spread out. So going there, not really having a game plan of how to get in, I think I just used my charisma and my my just being dumb, I guess, to what it is that I wanted to do and how to get in. And that kind of dumb luck opened the doors for me to meet some really great people. Tony Zetland was one of my very first mentors. And Tony came from the UK over to Hollywood with the Beatles when the Beatles went to Capitol. He was at Capitol London and moved and started working at Capitol Hollywood. And Tony had worked with Pink Floyd, the Beatles, Journey, all this stuff. And I lived in a little tiny studio apartment, and Tony lived on the top floor in like one of the big apartments. But I was introduced to him, and he was an older guy. I think he was probably, he's probably a little bit older than me now at my age, but he was just a guy that I kind of looked at, and I didn't worship him, but I just kind of looked at him like, this guy's done everything that I would like to go do. And so he and I just became really good friends. We would hang out. He took me to the Rainbow Bar and Grill for the first time. He would, he knew everybody, so he would get me in because I was just 17, 18 years old. So he'd take me around. He'd show me all, he showed me the Troubadour. He showed me the Roxy. He showed me on the Rocks. He showed me everything. And we would just have these great conversations about music history. We would go to his apartment and we would watch the history of the British invasion. And he would tell me about all the managers, the producers, the engineers that were working with all the different bands, band members leaving this band to start this band. And I would just sit up there and I really would just kind of soak so much stuff in. He also taught me my very first lesson. And that was, to shut the hell up and listen. Just when you're around people doing things that you want to do, it's better to sit there and just be quiet and say nothing and listen and just absorb everything.
Why do you feel that's so? Why do you feel like it's important to just absorb?
Because I think when you're young and you have a lot more energy than you do when you're older, and you're kind of living on this thing of excitement. Everything's exciting, right? It's new. And you tend to want to interrupt. You tend to want to add your 2 cents in. And your 2 cents really doesn't add value at that point. You don't really have 2 cents to add. So it was an extremely valuable lesson. It's funny, I was talking to a young musician a few months ago, and I was trying to tell him something. I was trying to give him some advice, and he kept interrupting me and well, I know how to do this and I can, and I was like, man, listen, you need to shut the hell up and you need to listen. You're 20 years old. You're wanting to do this. It's like, I've been there. And it was funny because it was like a full circle moment for me of giving the Tony Zetland lesson back to a young musician. And I think that you have one of two options. You can either take advice and you can heed that advice and you can really listen. Because I don't think that people, especially people like in that have done things that you really want to do with your life or in your life, when they give you that advice, they're not just giving you words, that's coming from a heart. It's coming from somebody that's very caring for somebody to give you advice, and you can either take the advice or you cannot listen to the advice. And I've just chosen to take advice. Even now I take advice. I listen to people that are better than me, and I try and surround myself with people that are better than me. And it just makes you better.
It does. And I feel it's important. I really appreciate how you took advice, right? Because I feel it's an interesting dynamic, right? It also depends upon who it comes from, but at the same token, as you mentioned, you could either take the advice and run with it, or you can choose not to. And I feel that for myself, and as yourself, you mentioned that you take advice, and I take advice all the time as well. And what I realize is that sometimes, depending upon who it comes from and what the advice is, I can determine whether that I feel it applies to me or not. And sometimes they are correct, sometimes they are not. And I feel like at the end of the day, you still have to go with your gut, right? I think 100%. It's really important. But at the same token, it's important to understand the difference between listening to advice and then actually taking the advice and running with it. Those are two very different things. Yep. Listening to the advice is about actually paying attention to what that person is saying to you. And that's very different, because if you're just completely ignoring it or just want to get into an argument, you're not truly listening to the advice that's being provided. I think it's very important to listen to that advice, especially to somebody that you respect. But then making your own determination whether that advice applies to you at that point in time or not. And right. I think that's a very different distinction between those two things.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
How did you meet Tony, by the way? How did that introduction came about?
So, I was so young moving in to this apartment complex. There was the landlord who ran it. And listen, I lived on Sunset Boulevard in Larrabee, which is a very famous area.
Wow. Yeah.
You've got the Viper Room, the Whiskey, the Roxy, the Rainbow.
Right,
Tower Records was right next door to my building. In fact, my balcony overlooked the rooftop of Tower Records. So it was a very famous building. Axl Rose lived in that building. Slash lived in the building. This very famous, probably the first reality star, Angeline, she lived there. And it was just like it was like a cast of absolute rejects in this place. And Tony happened to live there, and my landlord, her name was Lorraine. She was like everybody's grandmother, She threw a dinner party one night to introduce me to some characters in that building. And Tony just happened to be there, and he and I completely and utterly hit it off. Anytime you start talking with music with somebody, I think everybody else in the room just kind of disappears, and like the spotlight is on that one person because you're speaking the same language.
That's amazing. And I want to say this, especially because I feel like it still applies to today too, is being in a physical space. I mean, yes, we have so much access. You mentioned before, this is pre-internet, and the internet has opened up all kinds of possibilities. I mean, we wouldn't even have this conversation right now if it wasn't for the internet, right? But there is something to be said about physically being where things are happening. And yeah. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I currently live in Phoenix, Arizona. We have a wonderful music scene and music community here. But I also lived in Los Angeles for about a year too, and it's quite different to be in the area that all the things that you want to do are happening, because you're going to run into people. You're going to have the impromptu dinner party and meet people that way too, right? There's something to be said about those interactions and experiences that can help lead to opportunities.
Oh man, networking is probably the biggest tool that anyone can master, and it's something that you have to practice, you have to work on, you have to get really good at, and it is an art form, and it is a tool, and contacts are everything. Connections are everything. I mean, in this industry, jobs don't come through LinkedIn applications. They come from connections, you know.
100% agree. You seem like you're a very charismatic person. And do you consider yourself like an extrovert or an introvert or a combination of the two?
That's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that. I would imagine I'm an extrovert for sure. But there's definitely, there's the artist, creative inside of me that is introvert. I know when I'm at my social limits for sure. And I just kind of shut down. Yeah. So I would imagine it's probably not a balance. It's probably about an 80-20 extrovert.
About 80-20?
Yeah.
I think that's true for everyone. There's like a little bit of balance between what our social capabilities are, and some are swayed a little bit more on the introverted side than the extroverted side. I know for myself that I'm a little bit more on the introverted side than on the extroverted side, but over the years I trained myself to be a little bit more on the extrovert side. So I kind of balance that out a little bit more, where I feel before I started the 80-20 records, I was probably 80% introvert, 20% extrovert. And I kind of started balancing that a little bit more because, like you said, you have to build relationships if you want to be, especially in the music industry. I would say in a lot of industries, but especially in the music industry, like you said, a lot of it's based upon the relationships that you build. Yeah. And I learned that quite early on. And so I forced myself to go out to music shows, even if I didn't feel like going to one. I forced myself to go to networking events. I even went to networking events that had absolutely nothing to do with music, just so I can practice in pitching. I went to like a local it was one of those like local business meetups, and it's mostly like accountants and insurance salesmen. And here comes rolling in this kid that runs a record label. And so I was obviously the coolest person in the room because I'm running a record label in comparison to everybody else. And it was just me practicing being comfortable pitching myself and talking about myself. And that was incredible for my own growth to get comfortable in doing those things, because especially for me, that was so hard to do. I mean, I would normally freeze up and trying to talk to myself, but I full force put myself into it. And so for you, it's interesting to hear, because it definitely feels like you're more on the extroverted side, but also interesting that you mentioned that you feel a little bit more introverted when it comes to your music.
Yeah. Well, first of all, congratulations on mastering the craft, or even working on the craft. It's one of those things. I always tell you, I've always told artists, you're given a set of tools. You're given a set toolbox, right? Everybody has a different amount of tools in their toolbox. It's the work that you do on yourself, taking yourself outside of your comfort zone, doing things that you normally wouldn't do, that adds more tools into that box that then you're able to go in and start randomly pulling from when you need them. And everything is a craft. Networking is an art form. It really is. It's an art form. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things, the more you do it, the more you practice it, the better you become at it. You have your whole thing down. You have the way that you walk into a room, to the way that you approach people. It's funny. We were at my club this past weekend. So one of my mentors later on in life is a guy named Tony Brown, and Tony is the biggest music producer. He's the biggest country music producer of all time. Over 500 number ones. Wow. We did a surprise party for him on Saturday for the Country Music Hall of Fame. He was being inducted on Sunday, and at that party, it was literal legends, living legends, everywhere, that Tony had worked with. And, I just kind of looked around the room in awe, and I was like, I just can't believe, all these people are in one place. This is like a playground, And so I just pulled, tools out of that toolbox, and I just started going up to everyone and talking. And it wasn't really the club that connected everybody. It's kind of what you've done and how you did it and how you got where you are. And you just have to find that entry point. You have to find that icebreaker and be willing to have the balls to just walk up to somebody, introduce yourself, put your hand out, shake their hand, and tell them a really quick story, and then lean back and let them start talking to you. It's learning the icebreaker and then allowing the people to kind of feed you, because everybody wants, especially when you're younger and the person is older, they want to tell their stories. They want to talk, you just have to be willing to have that icebreaker. And then before you know it, you're pulling your phones out, you're swapping contacts, you're texting this person, let's grab lunch, and you just, you build on it.
I appreciate that you mentioned that, because that was a big part of networking that I also learned early on too, which is when you are in a room, your job is to ask everyone else questions. It's far more important to ask questions than it is to answer them. Yeah. Especially if you're the one who's trying to do the networking and to make those connections happen. But just asking them questions like, how are things going on your end? What are you guys looking for right now? What challenges are you facing, right? It's just constantly asking them questions. And same thing if you're just chilling with other people going, hey, what are you working on right now? What you've been up to? Oh, cool. You took a trip. How was the trip? Right. It's just trying, like you said, those icebreakers, and it helps so much to ask the questions rather than trying to get questions being asked to you.
Well, and you just nailed it too. And this is, speaking directly to any young person out there listening, or even introverts, right? Um, the icebreakers and what you're describing, and you nailed it, right? Even with asking your questions, it's who, what, when, where, why.
Yep.
That's all you need to know: who, what, when, where, why, and pick one of those things. And who did why did you do this? When did this happen? Just that's just just
It
gives
goes
you a
back.
toolbox to go in and start asking questions.
It goes back to the shut up and listen part, but I'll actually add to that is it's not even it's ask, shut up and listen. And I think it's like the ask part needs to be in there, that part of the equation too, right? It's ask, shut up and listen. And I think that's extremely important because again, when people feel comfortable talking to you, they're going to start building that connection, as you mentioned before with your mentors, is that they, you were asking questions and just absorbing what they said, and they were able to connect with you.
Yeah.
And that is just so important. And you just have to get comfortable asking those questions.
Like in just to add to that, on the topic of mentoring and ice breaking and networking, in 2005, I had a blog when blogs were popular. I had a blog
Yep.
called International Trendsetter, and it was music that I loved all over the world. A lot of unsigned bands, things like that, and then different like rock and roll books. And one of my heroes is a guy named Andrew Luke Oldham. If anybody doesn't know who he is, you should probably look him up. He was the guy that discovered the Rolling Stones. He was their manager and their producer. He was the guy that came up with the concept of the Stones, like the way that they were going to look and the way that they spoke. It was everything opposite of what the Beatles were doing. Andrew famously locked Keith Richards and Mick Jagger in a closet and put paper under the door and lit the door on fire and told them to go in there and write their first song, and they came out with a song. So I'd read Andrew's autobiography called Stoned, and on my blog I did a whole little book review and talking about Andrew and all of this, and I noticed one morning I got a comment on the blog, and it was like it was like a very short little comment, and it was like signed AOL, and and so I replied to him. I got that, I had the email, and so I replied, and I was like, "Is this Andrew Luke Oldham?" And I got an email back instantly, and it said, "Indeed." And
wow.
And then the ice is broken at that point, right? And I just went in, and I kept it very short, and I was like, "I've read about you my whole life. I've listened to your records. I've listened to the records that you've produced. I dress like you. I've modeled myself after you, and I just want to thank you for your contribution to music. You are just a real living legend." And ever since then, he wrote me back a very nice little letter. We kept in touch, and there was a time when I was contemplating a deal, and I didn't, I had an idea which way I wanted to go. So I just picked up my computer. I got on my computer. I wrote Andrew. I said, "Here's my scenario. Here's A, here's B. This is kind of what my gut is telling me. I just want your opinion, And it just comes back, and it's like, always follow the gut, mate, And it was like, so I've been able to use that connection for business things, and mentorship. Even though I've never met him, we were pen pals and went back and forth. And there's never was, especially in the day in the modern times, there's no excuses. There is every single possible way to get to anybody out there. It's just how creative are you going to be to grab their attention? And if you can grab their attention, then you can connect with them. And people 100%. are more than willing to share. In fact, people, once you get to a certain position, or a certain set of tools in your life, you want to give back. You know, you're just kind of waiting for people to ask for the help, or ask you a question, or ask for that piece of advice. And, you know, guys like me, or guys like Tony Brown, or, you know, Andrew Lou Goldham, you know, they're more than willing to give it. You just got to figure out how to connect and then ask.
It's very true. And I've learned that too, is that the higher that you go up in those who were successful in their careers, it's interesting on how accessible they truly are. It's maybe a little bit more challenging because depending upon where they are in their careers, if they're still extremely active, right, and they may be a little bit harder to get a hold of them. But some of them, you know, they're living a different type of life. They might have been slowing down a little bit because they accomplished so much. And like you said, a lot of them are willing to give back. A lot of them go into teaching, and they literally will teach at you know, colleges and universities, and some of them are just there to just provide advice, and because they want to help the next generation that's coming into the music business and to learn from them, right? And like you said, is that you can get creative on how to reach out to them, and you'd be surprised if you really start thinking about it and how I'm going to reach out to these people. Usually you will find some way of doing so. I've learned that too over the years, is that there are tons of ways that you can find a way to reach out to them, and do so. And I will add to that, and do so in a respectful manner.
100%.
That's the other important part too, is you got to be respectful about how you're reaching out to them.
And to add to that, you know, persistence is key. You'd be surprised how many offices I've sat in, and been invited into and told, listen, the only reason that you're here right now is because if we didn't set a meeting up, you were never going to leave me alone. You know, you were never going to stop. So you're here. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Let's go, you know, and then boom, you're in. And then it's up to you to make that first impression and to drive it in. And you're either walking out of there with a contact and a phone number, or you're walking out successful that you got in. You know, it's win-win. But persistence is everything. And yeah, there are people that are hard to get to, but you just got to know how to get to them.
So what's your take on persistence? Because there's a point of being persistent, and then also a point of being annoying, right?
Yeah.
Because there is definitely a dynamic between those two things, where I have this before, even being a record label, where I would have artists contacting us, where I appreciate persistence, but there's some that are way too overbearing, where they're contacting you on a daily basis. And it's like, I'll get to you, but now it becomes a point of being a turnoff, where they rather just ignore you than trying to. So you want to be that squeaky wheel, right? Where it's bothersome enough where you rather take the meeting, but because they're being respectful, you're willing to take the meeting. Yeah. If that makes sense.
It's an art, you know, It's an art form. If you go too hard, you look desperate. You have to go in, and there has to be a why. You know, why would I want to meet this person? And you have to present the why of why they're going to give you their time. And if you do that really respectfully, you know, you're going to get in. You're just going to get in. But you can't sit there and email somebody every day. I think the biggest thing is, you know, because I get a ton of emails every day, and I'll look at like young artist emails, and it's far and few between of somebody going, I've done my research on you. I know what you've done. You've done this, you've done that. My favorite song off of this album is this. I read about this deal that you did. That was awesome. I saw that in Billboard. By the way, you know, I've got this band. We've been together 3 years. Here's a short little data profile of where we are. And then there's a link. if you don't mind, would you just check it out? And if you have any advice or anything, I would love to hear your feedback. There's ways of doing it instead of just going right in for, let me ask you for something.
Yep. And you nailed it on the head, which is they did their due diligence. They did their homework, and that makes a huge difference. I've had artists that reach out to me that had nothing to do at all with any of the work that I've done before as both an artist manager and as a record label, that clearly I know the drill is that they're just emailing out anybody that has the word record label or management associated with it. Doesn't matter who they are. That is, not only is that the perfect way to not get a response, but now I'm thinking like, okay, you're just looking to take advantage of me. Even if your name pops up in the future, I'm still going to remember that you just spammed me for sending that email across. It does not look good at all when you do those things. If you're going to reach out to somebody, you said it best yourself. Why should I be responding back to you? That why is everything. And the why in that case scenario of what you presented was because they took the time to reach out to you because they respected your work. They did their homework. They listened to some of the work that you've done before. And there's now a reason why they selected you to reach out to ask for feedback.
100%. And I respond to those people.
So do I.
Yeah. I mean, if they if they took the time to research and they took the time to single me out, then there's a respect level there. And I'm going to give them the respect that they deserve. They might not like what I have to say, but I'm going to give them the same respect in return. And it's just, again, it goes back to really understanding what your goal is, and not being annoying, but persistent. Knowing when to, how to structure out emails. Everybody should be making charts of everything, right? You should document every email. If you're sending it to managers, if you're sending it to new music nights, to a DJ at a radio station, you should be documenting that. When the email was sent, did they respond? What'd they say? When do you follow up? Are they ghosting you? And you need to document that, because you can see, well, if I've emailed this guy 6 times and he's ghosting me, what am I doing wrong? Let me go back and let me read my emails, because if you do it right, you're going to get to them.
Yep, eventually. So sometimes it's also bad timing too. So I know that I usually do the rule of 4, which is I reach out 4 times, and depending upon the urgency of the reason why I'm reaching out to that person, it may be every week or maybe every 2 weeks. But then by the 3rd or 4th email, I might go out a month, right? Because maybe this is not the right time. And I'll go out maybe a month, maybe 2, depending upon the urgency. By the 4th email, if I still don't get a response, either A, like you said, they're just completely ghosting me, ignoring me, and I'm just not saying the right things that's going to get their attention, or B, is that they're just extremely busy and it's email number 1232 in their inbox and they're just not getting to it, right?
Yeah.
So in that case scenario, I'll go, okay, I'm going to take a break, maybe revisit this in 3 to 6 months,
right,
and then maybe try again. So I'll do that, or maybe I'll just say, okay, maybe this is just not the right match. They may be just ignoring me and move on. Just again, depends upon what I'm looking for out of connecting with that person. But again, I think by the 4th email, usually you can tell if they're not getting back to you. It's either because A, they're way too busy to deal with this, or B, they're just not interested. Well, and it's usually going to be one of those 2 things.
I'll tell you a great story. One of my best mentors ever was a guy named Bill Richardson. Bill had a record label called Rising Storm, and they signed a young band. Moved him into their basement, built him a studio, fed him, and really kind of worked this band. And the band had an album done, and Bill went out and he pitched it to labels, and he got 108 rejection letters. right? 108. I know this because I saw all of them. 108 rejection letters. And he was like, okay, well, I'm just going to go to radio now. And I'm going to see if we can get radio. So he put some money into radio, sent out the single, followed up, and nothing. Absolutely nothing, right? For 6 months, nothing. And then he called this one guy in Florida, program director. And he'd kind of gotten a little bit of a relationship with this guy because the guy told him no like 100 times. No, I'm not. I don't like it. So like that 100th time, that 100th phone call or whatever it was, the guy picks up and he's like, "Hey, Bill," and Bill's like, "You got anything for me this week?" And the guy, I guess it's timing or fate or it's a good day or you never know, right? But the guy goes, "Listen, I love your persistence. You've been respectful to me. I've told you no a million times. I've told you to never call me again and you keep calling me back." He's like, "I'm going to play something on the radio during my show." And he had a drive time show. He's like, "I'm going to play something, but I'm going to pick the song." And Bill's like, "Great. It's all I can ask. I appreciate you. It's all I can ask." The next day he played "Shine" by Collective Soul. And the board lit up. It's in heavy rotation by the next week. 2 months later, it's number one and stayed there, So it doesn't matter about the record label rejections. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if the DJs are saying no to you or the agents are saying no to you. You just have to find that one person that says, "Okay, I'm going to open the door." And then fate takes over from there. You may not have a shine story, but you may have a different story, or a different outcome. But no should be your greatest fuel for everything. Like people saying no, okay, well, I think yes. So we're gonna go prove them wrong. I've never done a deal ever in my career that's been an easy deal. It has always been, I've had to go out with groups and build something and make things happen, shake things up on a local level to the point where people from the coast start looking at you going, "What's going on over here?" You have to create something that they want. And if you can do that and you can make people come to you and you're not going to them, the deal structures change. They just change. The game changes because then you have more control. You're not going to somebody, they're coming to you. So persistence is just key, and no should be a motivating factor for anybody.
With the artists that you work with in the past, both at developing their talent as well as producing, I mean, we talk about a lot about, obviously persistence and, building connections and so forth, but what else do you look for when it comes to working with talent?
It's interesting, for me, there's a couple of things. Number one, if I've got something in my head, like, I tend to look at markets and go, well, there's no great American version of Coldplay, or we don't have somebody like Matchbox 20 any longer that fits a AAA hot AC format, that writes these great songs. We don't have a Train right now, So I look for holes in the market and then tend to start kind of looking around to see what bands are out there and do they have good material? Is it worth time? The second thing is just, it's really gut. I'll walk into something and I'll just be like, I know exactly what to do. And I know how I can come in and offer assistance or offer expertise or offer game planning and taking it from here to here. And so it's really those two ways. For the most part of my career, everything has just been gut. It's just been my gut, going like, oh, there's something right there, seeing artists like, there's an it factor that we all discuss. We know about, about it. Everybody knows about it, right? There's an it factor, and it separates them from everyone else. And when people have that it factor, I think your gut just automatically lights up and you go, okay, all right, there's really something here. What do they need? How can I help? But yeah, it's not rocket science.
Where do you feel representation is today when it comes to music artists? Because now there are so many options that are out there, right? So do you feel that artists should still pursue being represented on a record label? Do you feel like they should go off on their own? Should they get an artist manager? What are your feelings on representation, especially these days?
It's interesting. I'm finishing up a book, my first book right now. It's called So You Want to Be a Rock Star. And it's basically addressing all of that. I feel that the Gen Z and Gen Alpha, young kids, they're going to be focused on making their content, building their brand, doing it themselves, and they're not going to look to labels. I think that labels have really put themselves in a weak selling position. There is no more artist development. There's guys that are looking at TikTok algorithms and how can we take numbers and make numbers more. There are still a few guys out there that have, some real artist development. Scott Borchetta being one of them at Big Machine, he'll go in 8 years with an artist, and I admire that. But for the most part, labels don't offer that any longer. And managers aren't going to come in and save you. Managers aren't going to, they're not going to come in and add a lot of benefit on the front end if it's not making them money on the back end. So I think it's really kind of left up to them. And what I've learned is there's a roadmap. There's a roadmap of how to do it. And I've spent 30 years figuring this roadmap out and living this roadmap. And I think what's missing really is a guide for young people to follow in steps, And if you hit these steps, you might start at 0%. You may end up at 90%, But there's ways for artists to make money. There's ways to have a real career in all of this without relying on anybody. So, I've spent 30 years of my life trying to get people into the music business. And I think I'm going to spend the rest of my life teaching people how to stay out of the music business. And how to go do it yourselves and own your own content and build your empire, build your own legacy without having to sell everything out.
Yeah. Thank you for having your perspective on that, because I do agree is that we're at the point now where, even 20 years ago, record labels were still very much the gatekeepers to getting music out there, getting music into the stores, right? Or onto the radio, things like that. You can certainly do that on your own, but for the most part was done through record labels directly. That's definitely not the case anymore, right? And like you said, artist development is no longer really a thing. And I feel like we have this level playing field, if you will, across the board. So artists do have the ability now to do all these things on their own. I will say this is that I still feel that it can be helpful, right? So it was one of the reasons, because the record label, I'm not really doing that much anymore, because I also saw the writing on the wall, especially for independent record labels. I feel like independent record labels especially is a real hard time right now for them because of that exact reasons, that where they're showcasing their value. And I feel that artists don't necessarily it's what we talked about before, right? Where you mentioned about learning the instruments that you play, and that you understand how each one works, but you're not necessarily very good at, at any particular one. And I feel like the same thing is true with music businesses. There's so many things to understand: marketing, producing yourself, their distribution, and administration, publishing, licensing. There are so many different angles, as you mentioned before, about how you can make money from this, right? Is that it's not impossible, but extremely difficult to be an expert in every single one of these areas. And in that sense, right, is that maybe you understand X and Y parts, but you need a record label to help out with the administration and distribution work. Or maybe you need to get a publisher for the publishing side of things. Or maybe you need an artist manager because maybe you're the most creative person in the world, but you can't keep track of a calendar, right? And maybe you need an artist manager that's going to help you out with those things, and also to bring those connections and resources. Or maybe you don't need any of those things. Maybe it's something completely different, right? And so I think it's important to have that understanding where you don't have to anymore. I think that's the big part, is like, you don't have to, but it can also help you too. Because I also seen this too with younger artists, is that there's that badge of honor that I'm going to do it all by myself. I'm going to do it all on my own. And I both know that is furthest from the truth. You need help. You need support into accomplishing that roadmap, right? You're going to need it's like, sure, can you drive the car yourself? Sure, but it definitely helps when you have a couple of people in there to help you along the way, right? So it's very rare to do it all on your own and to get and to be also success, or whatever that success looks like.
I think just to interject really quick,
go ahead.
I think that my belief now, it goes back to kind of when I was doing deals and breaking artists, my thing, in my belief, my firm belief is, if you go to people too early, you've devalued yourself. You have to have people come to you, and you've got to create something that makes people want to come to you, right? So therefore, having that game plan and that roadmap just sets you on the right path to achieving that, right? And you might be, on step 9, and somebody's like, you're already building this momentum, and somebody comes in, they're like, hey, we can help. I'm not saying not to have help. I'm saying you've got to put the blinders on. You've got to stay focused. You've got to follow a plan. And then if something comes along the way, you have options now. You can look at options, but you don't necessarily have to take that option. You can hold out for another option, or you can options that's the key, it's the key. So yes, I do understand, like, where managers and agents and, labels come into play. And I'm not saying nobody should ever do that. I'm saying that you can't look at that anymore. Like, when I was coming up, that was the dream, right? In your garage bands, it was like, we're going to get signed by Capitol Records, or we all wore, record label T-shirts and stuff, and band gear, and it's just, that's not the case anymore. It doesn't work like that, So if you have a roadmap and a game plan of what you're going to do, what your next 2 years look like, and you're being held accountable by taking notes and everything, that's just it's gonna start to stir the universe up and start to stir, attraction. And if you stay on your horse blinded game plan, then things will start coming in. And I think that the options that's the key, having options.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I agree. And now there's more options than ever before when it comes to being a music artist. And I think that's overall a great thing. I think it's great that the status quo has changed. I think it's great that there's a level playing field, as as we're talking before. And I appreciate what you're saying, where there's options now. And I think that's the most important thing, is that there's options out there, honestly, for everybody. And I think that makes things far more interesting nowadays.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So on a completely different subject, you've done all this incredible work with artists over the years, and then decided to work on a music venue, which is obviously still within music, but that's a completely different thing. So talk more about that. Like, how did the Eighth Room come about? Like, why did you decide to start a venue to begin with?
Okay, so it was out of necessity, really. First and foremost, I think that anybody that's in the music business, that's well traveled, that's been to bars and venues all over the world, I think it's always in the back of your head. Oh, it'd be really cool to have one of these, one day. For me, I started my career in Nashville really in 1995, and there was a place called the Douglas Corner, and that was it was a songwriter's haven. Everybody's played there, Tony Brown signed Trisha Yearwood on that stage. Clint Black was signed on that stage. Garth Brooks, Blake Shelton, Big and Rich. The history goes on and on and on, right? And I left Nashville in 2001 and back to LA. And then we moved back to Nashville during COVID. And I moved right down the street from the Douglas Corner, and I was walking by it one day and noticed that it was shut down. And so I started kind of peeking my head in. I met the realtor. I was talking to him about it, and I just kind of figured like Trisha Yearwood or somebody would go in and buy it, because that's where their career was started, And one day I found. The realtor told me that, there was a bid in, and it was going to become like a hip hop hookah lounge. And I was just like, not on my watch, like this room needs to remain a music venue, just because of the history. So I went home and talked to my wife, and, now we own a bar and a music venue. And again, it wasn't one thing I set out to be in the bar business or a music venue business. It was, I wanted to save a piece of history, and keep the tradition in that location going, because so many small venues are going out of business everywhere. And we need rooms like that, like showcase rooms. Back in like 96, 97, I would go to showcases like twice a week, and you go into these rooms and you see like every person in there that are record men in a city. And you think to yourself, if that artist goes up on that stage and they bleed for this, their life can change because of the people that are in this room tonight. And so I really wanted that in Nashville. And so, that's why we're in it. And it's been great fun. Shinedown opened our club up. We've had everybody play. I mean, Queen played the night before. They did Bridgestone Arena here. Parker McCullum was in there last week. We just had these great artists, and we're championing some local artists like Adam Mack. He's playing tonight. He's a guy that's played our club for 3 years, and now People magazine has deemed him country music's very own Elton John. He was just on the Kelly Clarkson show. In November, he'll be named Billboard's young artist, up and coming artist of the month. So you're seeing, that's really what I want. I want to be able to champion those guys, and there's nothing else behind it other than really kind of trying to save history.
I very much admire that. So that's a huge risk that you took on to not only preserve history, but I also appreciate the fact that you mentioned before about the showcase, which I always loved, right? And it goes kind of back to what we were saying before about connecting with other people, and that you are literally creating a space for people to come into and to essentially connect with each other. And in this case, connecting by showcasing performances up on stage for these amazing artists to get these opportunities.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I tell artists all the time, I'm like, when you're in my club, if you see somebody that you don't know, just walk up to them, introduce yourself, tell them hi, ask them what they do, because you never know who's in there. You never know, just great networking. And I love it.
One other thing I saw too, which I appreciated, was there was a note on the website about dressing to impress, which I also thought was kind of interesting too. So is that do you have a dress code coming to the venue, or is it more about the vibe? I was just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, there's not like a strict dress code. I mean, there's no shorts and Birkenstocks. Go home and dress up a little bit. I don't want people dressing like they go to the airport and coming in. I want people looking their best, because again, you never know who's going to be in there. And a first impression is the only impression. And so like if you look like a rock star and you talk like a rock star, you're going to represent yourself as a rock star. And so I think that's kind of like the attitude is like, if you're coming in, you might want to look the part.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Well, we can start wrapping things up here. I do have a couple of fun questions for you.
Let's go.
So the first question I have for you is, what was the very first concert that you ever went to?
Beach Boys in
nice.
1977 at the Biloxi, the Biloxi Centralplex. Yeah.
That's a really good one. That's a great one.
Fleetwood Mac opened up for him.
Oh, okay. Now I'm jealous. I mean, Fleetwood Mac, but also I love the Beach Boys. I never unfortunately have a chance to see them live, but that's a really good one as the first concert. That's a good one.
My first album, Endless Summer, Beach Boys. Oddly enough, I've got it signed by all the Beach Boys.
Oh, that's very cool. Were you able to meet them in person and get them to sign it?
At different times.
Really cool.
Yeah, I've got got all the signatures.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Do you have a go-to artist that you're listening to right now, or somebody that you really are paying attention to?
I'm listening to Oasis a lot. I mean, nice. I was a massive fan of them in the early 90s, and they've just kind of taken the world over again. They've done it again. Mm-hmm. They're the biggest band in the world for the second time.
Which is crazy to think about, because they haven't played in so long together, and then all of a sudden they got back together, which I don't think anybody expect that to happen.
Yeah.
Now they're touring again, which is amazing.
I went and saw them opening night at Wembley.
Nice.
And then I saw them at the Rose Bowl show in Los Angeles. Great. They're fantastic. I mean, I've seen those guys 4 or 5 times throughout their term, but I wasn't going to miss a show in London,
Absolutely.
It was epic. Yeah. Yeah.
If you were only able to give one piece of advice to somebody else, what would that one piece of advice be?
There's one choice that you have to make in life, right? You have to either 100% go for it and leave it all on the table. Whatever it is that you're doing, you have to go for it. You have to give everything that you possibly have. Or the other option is you just settle. And I think that you have to pick it. And the faster you can make that choice, the faster you're setting yourself up for your life path.
Yeah. That's very good advice. Wow. So no, I couldn't say it better myself. It's always interesting because always reflecting myself too, and like trying what I want to accomplish in life and so forth. And I've been doing this for a long time too, and it's always a question of even now it's do I double down on the things I want to accomplish, or do I want to to settle where I'm currently at? And it's always a hard question to answer. And yeah. I don't necessarily even feel like there's a right or wrong. It's just being honest with yourself as far 100%. As what you want to accomplish in your life and what you want your life path to be moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
There's a lot of sacrifices with success.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
Well, Hollis, thank you so much again for your time and talk about this. This was so much fun, and it really was inspiring to hear your story. So thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure, my man.